I'm Dr Gemma Briggs. I'm a cognitive psychologist based at the Open University, and my area of research interest and expertise is distracted driving, specifically mobile phone use by drivers. In this presentation, we're going to discuss some of the research we've carried out in this area, looking at the cognitive roots for distraction. We're also then going to move on to think about what this means for people who drive for a living, and also about people who employ those who drive for a living. Before we launch into discussing some of the research findings and how mobile phone use can negatively affect your driving performance, I often find it useful to give people the experience of some of the effects that we're going to discuss. So in this brief animation that you're going to see shortly, I'd like you to just count the number of cars that you see. So this demonstration shows something known as inattention blindness, and this probably will have worked for about 40% of people who view a film like this. So inattention blindness is the inability to notice things that happen right in front of your eyes because your attention is applied to another task or to something else. So for those of you who didn't notice the sign changing, you shouldn't be alarmed. What this demonstrates is your ability to focus your attention. You were given a clear instruction to count the number of cars, and you focused your attention on achieving that goal. For those of you who did notice the sign changing, you may or may not have noticed the additional changes, one of which was a gradual change in colour of the grass, and the other was a more stark onset of a face appearing in the sun. Now, what these findings tell us is that humans are very able to focus their attention, and this is something we need to do in everyday life. We need to focus on a task at hand and ignore other information, sensory information that's still coming in via our senses. But what we also know about attention is that different types and amounts of attention are required for different types of task, and the demands on our attention placed by a particular task can vary across time. How we allocate our attention can also vary, dependent on things such as our changing goals, how we prioritise tasks, what our previous experience is with that task. And when we try to multitask, by which we mean try to do more than one task at a time, we have to think about what that means in terms of our overall amount of attention. As humans, we have a finite amount of attention. It isn't limitless. And therefore, when we try to do two things at once, sometimes those tasks might draw on common resources or common brain areas. And that's something we'll come back to later. So our research into mobile phone use by drivers has demonstrated that inattention blindness is a real issue. And by that we mean a driver who's talking on the phone can look directly at something yet not see it because their attention is on their mobile phone. So, our research findings and those of many others have demonstrated that drivers who talk on their mobile phone are 4 times more likely to be involved in a collision. This effect lasts for around 5 minutes after the call has ended, which suggests that it's something cognitive, it's something about the brain rather than perhaps just physically holding or manipulating a phone. They're also far less likely to notice and therefore react to any hazards that occur. And any hazards that they do notice, they take significantly longer to react to. And we'll think about what that means in terms of reaction times and stopping distances a little bit later. They often show poor lane discipline in a similar way that a drink driver might. And they make more variable speed choices. So research has shown that while they're on the phone, they might speed up and then slow down as the demands of their phone conversation varies. And they also use compensatory strategies, which is a polite way of saying they don't use their mirrors and they don't use their indicators, as they try to reduce the amount of demands placed by the driving task on their attention so that they can carry on dual tasking, or multitasking in this way. And none of these factors are actually improved by using a hands-free mobile phone, which often comes as quite a surprise to many people. But there's decades of research carried out using multiple methods, different approaches by different labs, on-road testing, which has demonstrated that hands-free phone use is equally distracting and equally dangerous as handheld phone use. Now, this finding is relatively unpopular, and I can understand why that might be the case, particularly because of what the law tells us. But if we compare distraction with other types of activities that might happen shortly before or within the vehicle, we can think about levels of danger. So some of the activities that a driver could engage in whilst driving would include handheld phone conversation, hands-free phone conversation. You might have children in the back, a screaming child, arguing children. A driver could send a text message whilst driving. They could have a conversation with their passenger, and then there's the issue of drink or drug driving, so something that's happened before they've entered the vehicle but will impair their driving nonetheless. Now, if we ask people to rate these things in terms of danger, what's the worst possible thing that a driver could do, the typical response would look something like this, which is that drink or drug driving is the most dangerous thing that somebody could do, followed by handheld phone use and texting. And then less of an issue would be having a screaming child in the back of the car or arguing children, having a conversation with a passenger, or having a hands-free phone conversation. Now, as you can see here, I've separated these 6 items out, and you can see that the top 3 of a typical response are the factors which are illegal. Of course, we all know that it is illegal to drive whilst intoxicated. It is illegal to physically hold your mobile phone whilst driving in the UK, including when you're stopped in traffic. And the bottom items are, of course, perfectly legal. There's no law against your child screaming in the back of the car, you having a chat with your partner whilst they sit in the passenger seat, and it is perfectly legal to have a hands-free phone conversation. So it makes a lot of sense that people would rate these in terms of danger. But what research says is slightly different and paints a different picture. So the effect on driving performance in terms of risk of collision, and there are other things that we could think of on top of collision risk, so we could look at hazard detection and reaction times and stopping distances, but in terms of risk of collision, the factors of drink driving, handheld or hands-free mobile phone use and texting are kind of on a par. Individual studies will put things like texting at times worse. So there's one study published that demonstrated that you're 23 times more likely to be involved in an incident, in a collision, if you're texting behind the wheel. And equally, there's research suggesting that hands-free phone conversation can be more distracting than being at the legal drink drive limit. Now, that can be relatively surprising to many. And of course, the factors of having a conversation with someone in the vehicle and having screaming children in the back, while these factors can be distracting, of course, for various reasons, they're less likely to affect your collision risk. And you might manage those things in slightly different ways that we'll come back to in a minute. So what do drivers often say in reaction to this research? As I say, I'm aware that it's unpopular to hear that hands-free phone conversation is a danger. The most common response is, well, it's surely no different from talking to a passenger. Are you going to ban that next? And we'll come back to that in a second. We have the need to be available and the need to be contactable all of the time, whether that be for work or perhaps because your family members might need you. And then comments such as, well, if it was dangerous, it would be illegal, suggesting that we need to, the law is our guide as to what we should and shouldn't be doing in a vehicle. And whilst I wouldn't necessarily dispute that, it's not necessarily the case that the law follows research findings. And an overarching issue is that most drivers believe that they are better than the average driver. So this response, I'm better than the average driver, I can multitask just fine, and the factor of, I agree it's a problem, but I've never had a crash whilst using my phone, reflect this quite nicely. By definition, we can't all be above average drivers. Some have to be better than average, some have to be worse than average, and some have to toe the line of being completely average at driving. The fact that you haven't had an accident or a collision whilst using your phone up to this point doesn't actually hold any bearing on what might happen in the future. And what we also know from research is that often people are unaware of how unaware they are whilst using their phones whilst driving, and therefore may be unaware of incidents that have occurred whilst they've been on the phone. So to address this issue of, well, hang on, hands-free phone use is the same as talking to a passenger, we've carried out some research, and many others have too, and it seems to come down to the issue of shared environment. So a passenger is within the vehicle. They have a vested interest in their own survival and hopefully yours as the driver's too. So they can see what you can see, and they can moderate the demands that they make on your attention. If they see something challenging happening, they can either stop talking and demanding your precious attention, or they might actually help you out by saying, have you seen this car coming up on your inside? Someone on the phone doesn't have the benefit of that shared environment, but some of our research has further demonstrated that when you have a conversation with somebody on the phone, you tend to make mental images in your head of where they are, what they're describing, what they're up to. And our research was able to demonstrate that these mental images require the same cognitive resources and the same brain areas as are needed for accurate visual perception. And by that we mean a good ability to be able to look at the driving scene and not just look but see, take in that information. For further details and explanation of this study, if you're interested, you can have a look at the BBC Ideas film that we made, and the link's there on the slide. So what happens in your brain is that this visual area of your brain, which is the purple area of the brain here, is needed for both the phone conversation, because you're creating these mental images, and it's also needed for visual perception, for keeping track of what's going on in that driving scene. So what you in effect create is competition in your brain for limited attentional resources. As with most competitions, one side wins. So if the phone task wins the attentional resources, then your driving performance can deteriorate in the ways that we saw at the start. So we're talking reduced hazard detection, increased collision risk, and longer reaction times for those hazards you do notice. So what happens to your driving, and what we've been able to demonstrate through our research, is that yes, you have this very poor hazard detection. And this is a particular problem for hazards that happen in the peripheral areas, to the sides of the scene. If you think about what peripheral hazards might be, it's things like a child stepping off a pavement into the road, or a vehicle joining a stream of traffic from a junction. So those hazards that our distracted drivers did notice, they took a lot longer to react to, and that massively increased their stopping distances. And you can see it, the graphics here at the side of the screen demonstrate what that additional stopping distance is. So at 30 miles an hour, we had an additional stopping distance of over 13 metres, and that's on top of your standard stopping distance of 23 metres. You think about how far a vehicle could travel in that time and where 30-mile-per-hour limits tend to be, that could have quite catastrophic outcomes. So what we were able to demonstrate is that drivers who talk on the phone can look without seeing. You'll see this graphic at the top with a black rectangle. We were able to demonstrate by using eye tracking data that our distracted drivers looked at an area of the scene 4 times smaller than our undistracted drivers. So they tend to focus their visual attention directly ahead of them, not looking much to the sides, to the peripheral areas. But even if we introduced a hazard where their eyes were pointed at, they very often failed to notice that hazard. They were looking without seeing. And this takes us back to inattention blindness that we demonstrated at the start of the presentation. So the message from this research is that having 2 hands on the wheel and both eyes on the road isn't enough if your mind is elsewhere. So this begs the question, well, hang on, we're constantly told to multitask, that multitasking is part of modern life. Is this all a myth? Well, we can maintain 2 or more tasks, and it feels like we can do that. But actually, what we're not doing is equally dividing our attention between those tasks. What we're most likely doing is quickly switching our attention between those tasks. And when we do that, there's a bit of a blank in the task that doesn't currently have our attention. And our brains are incredible in that they can fill in some of those gaps using our best guess based on previous experience with those different types of tasks. Now, normally this is absolutely fine in everyday life, but when you're driving at 70 miles an hour down a motorway in a couple of tons of metal, your brain's best guess isn't enough. The basic message is driving requires all of your attention all of the time. You never know what's coming up, and even the most experienced driver doesn't necessarily have increased ability to control their attention. It simply doesn't work that way. So, what should you do if you employ people who drive for you for a living? Well, some of these factors might seem relatively obvious because you want to make clear to your drivers that you need to keep them and other road users safe. But what you need is a clear mobile phone policy for all employees. And you need to recognise that the law alone might not be the best guide for what that policy should be. You need to make that policy, whatever that policy is, applicable to absolutely everybody in the organisation. I've put here including management, which might sound quite glib, but I've worked with many companies who've identified that often senior management will engage in hands-free conference calls, for example, despite their company having a policy of 0 phone use. If that trickle-down effect comes through, they had drivers within that organisation saying, well, the bosses don't comply with the policy, so why do I need to? It's really important that you don't shift from one dangerous type of phone use to another. So banning handheld phone use by drivers is absolutely a great thing, but pushing people to hands-free phone use and suggesting that this is a safe alternative simply isn't backed up by any of the research in this area. You need to have realistic targets for drivers to reduce the need for them to have more and more communication whilst they're driving. And there are different strategies dependent on the type of business that we're talking about. So those strategies for when communication is needed need to be clear. Are you requiring your drivers to stop periodically throughout their day, park up and report back to the office? Can they stop and send a text message from outside of their vehicle? It needs to be very clear. And at the same time, you can't have management trying to contact drivers at times when you know that they're behind the wheel, particularly if those drivers will feel the pressure as an employee to answer the phone when their manager calls them. You should also have clear education for your drivers as to why phone use is dangerous, not just that it is. And we've certainly found that when you can explain some of the science behind research in this area, it can certainly add to behaviour change, but it can be more convincing. It's not just you must follow this rule for the sake of following this rule. There are very sound, clear reasons as to why this rule is in place, and it is to protect you. So what should employees do? What should they be aware of if you're driving for a living? I would suggest that the first thing you need to do is have an awareness of shared responsibility. So although your employer might quite rightly say to you, it's your driver's license and it's your job on the line if you don't follow our policy, equally it's your employer's responsibility to ensure that you have working conditions that are conducive to protecting both your license and your job. And that means them having a clear mobile phone policy. You need to be accountable. So now that you're aware of the significant dangers of phone use, you need to try to make steps to change your behaviour so that you avoid using your phone behind the wheel. In the same way that people wouldn't drink drive whilst driving for a living, or in any other context, hopefully, mobile phone use whilst driving needs to become as socially taboo, I would argue. You need to challenge or question your employer if their mobile phone policy doesn't appear to be being followed at whatever level, and question what can be changed to make that work. If you're still unconvinced and think, well, listen, I've used hands-free phones for a long time and never had an incident, think back to what we talked about in terms of being better than an average driver and how unaware you are, and you can be, of how unaware you are. So the important thing to remember here is that whilst you might not, and hopefully never will, have some kind of great catastrophic incident or collision whilst using a hands-free phone, the possibility is always there, and your increased risk is significant. It also sometimes helps to think about life outside of work. What would you think is appropriate for other drivers, and compare that to what you do. If you're a parent, for example, walking your child to school, how do you feel when you see a driver texting behind the wheel? How does that make you feel in relation to your safety, your child's safety, and that driver? And if that's an activity that you carry out in a different context while you're at work, maybe think about the different work-life contexts and how that might change your opinion. We've got lots of different useful resources available to help explain this research, to experience a level of distraction, and to talk about what might be best practice in terms of communicating research findings and different strategies for companies to use. Dr Helen Wells and Dr Leanne Savigar-Shaw worked on the Brilliant Mobile Engaged project and produced a compendium. There's a brand new version coming out imminently, and the link's there on the screen. And it's packed full of information that's relevant to business, industry, as well as just average, normal, everyday drivers, and how we can communicate research findings in an effective way, and how you might think about policy for mobile phone use by drivers in your company, for example. Secondly, to allow some evidence-based education, we at the Open University have produced a short interactive activity called Are You a Focused Driver? Again, the link's there on the slide, and it allows you to try out being a distracted driver in a safe environment and then explain some of the research. The idea behind this is it's evidence-based, it's clear, it's immersive, and it's presented in a non-judgmental way. I will leave it there. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please do get in touch. I'm very happy to receive emails. Also have a look at our website for more resources. Thank you.